Welcome to this small but important gathering about violence against women. Just over 40 years ago, I was one of 5 people who established the first refuge for what were then called battered women in the north of England. Chesterfield and then Stoneborough, and Leeds was getting established at the same time. For 5 years, I was totally obsessed, although also bringing up 3 boys and trying to earn, on my own, and trying to earn our living. And as we know, difficult times sees an upsurge in domestic violence. Way back in the 80s, I remember that Hull Town Council made a house available to Women's Aid when the closure of local works was announced. And you'll see there's been something very similar announced recently. Times were very different then. Police would bring men to the refuge to find their women, as it was the men's right. Our Police and Crime Commissioner hasn't managed to come today, but I hope she would be pleased to know that I recently had a very positive experience of the police in respect of threats of violence from a relative who is now in a rehab. The safeguarding interview, I'd never heard of them before, but the safeguarding interview I was offered with a young policewoman was excellent and reassuring. So there's definitely some more positive movements. So it was at this point I was going to introduce Angelique Foster, Derbyshire's new Police and Crime Commissioner. 2 years ago, we had the previous Police and Crime Commissioner here for a discussion about creating peaceful communities, and that was a very useful with how to do so. So a few words about Angelique Foster. She's a Conservative politician who's been a local councillor for about 11 years and is leader of Drumfield Town Council. She has a background in law, and the long list of her aims in her new role, well down on the list, was to tackle complex issues of domestic violence and drug-related crime. Angelique also includes in her aim to increase partnership working, something that might have been helped perhaps by today's workshop. Our 2 contributors who have turned up today are both well known in Derby and beyond, so I won't say too much about them. Sonya Robotham. Where to start with Sonya? She has an impressive academic background and is a real community activist. Director of Operations at Spectrum Derbyshire and a Vox Feminarian. She's a restorative justice practitioner and has so many more roles, being in demand in different parts of the country as a speaker. Sonya also finds time to prioritise her work at the Mandela Centre on such trivial matters as food banks. Vanessa Boon, again, what to say? Where to start? Vanessa is well known in Derby for her radio work and describes herself as a lead difference maker, founder of Energize, People Development and Diversity. She is, among many other things, a trainer with WISE, Women into Science and Engineering. Vanessa is well known for her support and guidance for community projects, dismantling inequalities and dispelling stereotypes. Vanessa also enjoys a good scene with rebel women. So before I hand over to you 2, would you like me to read a bit written about domestic violence by our speaker who should have been here? Would you like me to? Yeah, I will read some of this here, maybe skip bits. Derbyshire Police and Crime Commissioner Angelique Foster had secured nearly £660,000 from the Home Office to reduce domestic abuse across Derby and Derbyshire. This additional funding will be invested in a series of domestic abuse intervention projects aimed at stopping perpetrators from inflicting further harm, providing greater protection to their partners and families. It will also provide increased support for young people at risk of becoming future abusers and fund intervention work with adolescent perpetrators and their families. So there must be a lot of partnership work going on there. and building on previous work, I think. Police and Crime Commissioner says protecting victims and families from the threat of domestic abuse in Derbyshire is a top priority, and I'm determined to secure as much funding as possible to achieve this and put it in the right place to measure for local measures. I'm just going to go through six projects will be delivered between now and 31st of July next year through local providers. Intervention will include one-to-one and group therapy, educational intervention, family work, and community-based activity. Domestic abuse support charity Care will lead a community-based early intervention project working with male perpetrators as well as children and young people who have experienced violence in the home and are showing early signs of using violence in their lives. Jacqueline Bell, Director of Services for Care, said, "We've known for years that many who perpetrated domestic abuse need advice and support to change in order to reduce domestic abuse, and there's been projects in Amber Valley, which has one of the highest incidents of domestic violence in Derbyshire." So this grant allows us to run a group for men who accept the impact that their behaviour has on their family, friends and community. The grant will also fund ABC project run by the Elm Foundation to increase the safety and well-being of victims and their children by delivering effective interventions. Helen Mitchell, Head of Operations with the Elm Foundation, said this funding is a fantastic opportunity for domestic abuse support in Derbyshire. So I'll just cut Charity Remedy, that's another one, I think that's how you say it, will be working restoratively with young people affected by domestic abuse to deliver the following: Cease Intervention Programme, 4-session one-to-one programme for young people 13 to 17 who are displaying controlling or coercive behaviour. Cease Education Programme, a 4-session group educational programme to build awareness and understanding, and Together Families Programme, which works intensively with the whole family over a 12-week period. So nationally, the Home Office has awarded 11.3 million to 25 police and crime commissioners across England and Wales to fund domestic abuse intervention programmes. So that's the end of what she would have been saying, and Costa would have been saying. My little cynical mind just remembers that the last time any money was put into positive providing of a refuge was when Hull knew they were closing down a factory, and knew that was in the 80s. They knew there would be domestic violence, and that's when Hull Council offered a house. Sorry to be so cynical, but there we go. Yeah. So over to you two ladies now. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for your contribution to the cause. Be a pioneer, one of those women who fought for refugees, the same thing that we're fighting for today. It's just shameful that we've made regressive rather than progressive steps, so thank you. And I am completely aware that we've got a really impressive women in the audience, practitioners, and activists in their own right. So my speech will preach into the converted, by and large, my presentation rather. And I am really, I've prepared this so hopefully it goes out to a wider audience. So if it becomes a bit much, just kind of, so kind of shut out the bits that you think, yeah, okay. So thank you, and thank you all for coming in. Thank you so much to Derby Peace Week Committee for allowing us to come, for inviting us to come to speak, and for making space for this discussion to take place. It's one that's really long overdue. Okay, so I'll start then. Okay, I'll speak over that, and I'm using notes today because I have throat and memory issues. I've been moving home the last 4 days, and so I don't want to forget anything. So here it is, using my mobile phone to guide me today. So I want to start by personalising somewhat the issue, and then I'll come back to personalising it at the end. So this subject is something that I'm really passionate about as an academic, a community organiser, a woman, a mother, a grandmother, human, and a human being. It's a subject that I've campaigned and raised awareness about, protested, marched, demonstrated on conferences and workshops and mentoring, and you name it. We've tried everything. And I say we collectively, because I know I don't do these things alone, and we learn from each other and borrow from each other as well as the larger movement of women. For more than 3 decades, I've been doing work around this issue, and it hasn't gotten any better, if I have to say. So as you can imagine, I've got a lot to say with 3 decades worth of personal experience, training, education, listening to people, talking to people, and then listening and talking to me. And it was a big shame that it took this is not an easy subject. And I cannot just simply present it as if it is. So if I get upset, it's not because I'm weak, it's because I'm really, really angry, and tears are my go-to on these occasions. Because it's shocking that women are being killed and murdered, and it seems like our society is uninterested. Okay, so if I get upset one time or two, forgive me for that, but believe me, it isn't weakness, it doesn't mean I'm giving up. It's because I'm so angry about what is going on and the seeming lack of care, lack of awareness and inaction around doing something to protect women and girls. Okay, so the bit I got to that moved me was the fact that it took the death of 3 more women, the murder of 3 women recently. And I'm not talking about the ones in Bracy in Chesterfield, or Vanessa was informing me, I've not watched any news at all the last 3 days, that there's been a recent incident with the family and we're waiting to see what happened. And it's just blow after blow after blow. It's enough already. It's really enough. Okay. Beaver Henry, Colson Mormon, sisters murdered. Not a lot of outcry about them. And then came Sarah Everard, brutally murdered, to bring us here. And finally, it feels as if the government is listening, and I hope that I'm right. I hope that it's not just money and words and empty, half-baked bills and amendments and actions. I hope that it's more than that. I hope the media sustains whatever they are doing, because the media, sort of creates a big hullabaloo about something and then disappears back into the ether again. Yesterday's news. Okay, so I want to start by this contribution by defining the word peace, because as an academic, I think it's always good to have a working definition of what it is you're talking about. The Merriam-Webster dictionary online offers a 4-fold definition of the word peace. Firstly, freedom, or a period of freedom from public disturbance or war. Secondly, a quiet or calm state of mind. Thirdly, agreement or harmony among people. Fourthly, an agreement to end war. Note that only one of these refer to actual physical war in which you have civilians and non-civilians. A second, more simplified definition of peace comes from the Cambridge Dictionary Online. And I like this definition because it speaks to so many elements of peace. They define peace as freedom from war or violence, especially when people live and work together happily without disagreement. And what strikes me about this definition is the ordinariness of it in some way. Yes, it talks about war, but it's talking about the everyday, peace in the everyday, which is one of the reasons why this subject fits so well with the theme of peace. It's part of it. So I want to really select a few of the key words across the 2 definitions, because I will come back to them later on in my presentation. And the first is the word freedom. The second is the phrase freedom from public disturbance. The third, freedom from violence. The fourth, a quiet or calm state of mind. So it's talking about well-being, how you feel, how you are, how you're able to live in quiet and harmony. Fifthly, agreement and harmony is part of that definition. And the sixth phrase I'd like to pick out, living and working together happily without disturbance. It's not talking about bombs being dropped or, you know, the kinds of things we see in far off lands. And these things are important and they are part of the conversation. They're a very important part of the conversation on peace. But we're talking about from peace in the home to that kind of war, to the kind of war that we tend to associate with the word peace. Sorry, my phone keeps shutting off. So please keep these keywords in mind. We'll come back to them towards the end. Now I want to argue something that feminists have argued for decades. It's nothing new, but people think you're over-exaggerating or being a drama queen. And that is that violence against women and girls, what is often shortened to VAW, amounts to a war on women. It amounts to a war on women and girls. Why? Because it's systematic, it's sustained, it's restricting, it's traumatizing, and is experienced from cradle to grave. And I think it's very important to begin to outline the nature of this war, which is really what I'm going to do for the bulk of my presentation. I want to do this on 3 levels of analysis, and the first is the international. The second is the national, or scrap international, the global. I prefer that term for lots of reasons. So the global, the national, and the local stroke personal. Let's start with global. We live in a world where a girl was and can be shot in the head for wanting an education, as happened to Malala Yousafzai. Girls are kidnapped, can and were kidnapped from their school en masse, as happened in the case in Nigeria. Women are beaten in the street for not dressing modestly, dragged off stage for singing in public, stoned to death if accused, not found guilty, but accused of adultery. A world where female genital mutilation, FGM, is acceptable, normal, required, and these are to all may suffer psychological and physical challenges and pain from the moment she's cut. In fact, the psychological pain can start long before that. We live in a world where women are raped and murdered because they are poor, as happens in many cases around the world. Perhaps some of the most better-known cases come from India, rural parts of India, where this happens. Women can and are groomed, trafficked, as happened in the case of Jeffrey Epstein. So it's not restricted to poor developing countries, it's global. We live in a world where lesbians can be subject to corrective rape to change their behaviour, where many women have no control of their fertility or their bodies. Husbands have rights, entitlements, and jurisdictions, and women have none. Where trans women are marginalised, and likely to be murdered for being who they are, often because of shame, ignorance, and hatred. Where women are excluded from peace talks, despite the fact that it's been proven time and time again that when women are engaged in peace talks around the world, where there's been long protracted war, the peace is longer lasting when they are sitting around the table. Time and time again, the evidence is there, and yet international bodies, local organisations exclude them, and the peace fails and war prevails. We live in a world where rape is an act of power and degradation, a way for men to take revenge on other men. Women are sometimes just an instrument, an object. An act which renders, in this instance, women victims. These victims of violence is invisible in the whole process, and where rape is literally an act of war. We live in a world where the feminists who seek to fight this war with words, reasoning, demonstrations, and other non-violent means are called feminazis. They're likened to systemic murderers, and people laugh and joke. Feminists are belittled and minimized and marginalized for the work that they do. Trying to fight this war to stand up for other women, feminism has become such a dirty word that even other women will go to great pains to deny that they're a feminist. And why? And despite the many forms of feminism which exist, from liberal to radical forms of feminism, people remain completely uneducated about the fact that there are about 10 different types of feminism. In fact, new ones being emerging all the time. You can choose what kind of feminist you want to be, but it's reduced to bra burning and men hating. All of this is to silence the work that feminists are trying to do. We live in a world where young men self-identifying as incels turn their anger and frustration at their life, their lack of achievement, or whatever it may be, on women, writing manifestos and plotting about how they're in quite great detail, how they're going to murder, mutilate, and rape. Now let's look at the national picture, and I bring this back to this country. And I'm not saying that some of what happens globally isn't relevant here. I'm just trying to scale it in a way that makes it perhaps more understandable that when we talk of peace, it exists at those different scales of analysis. Here we live in a country where children are not protected, and we wonder what on earth could have happened. What has he seen or experienced when during story time a 5-year-old boy keeps pushing his hands down the pants of a 5-year-old girl, or any 5-year-old girl sitting on the carpet beside him? This actually happened. And as a parent, you don't find this out until years after. A country where little girls are conditioned to believe that when boys like you, he pulls your hair and pinches you. We live in a country that when Black and brown women are murdered, there is often no outcry of public outrage. We live in a country where many women and girls won't report the violence and abuse they suffer because they know the system might victimize them further and they'll be judged by everybody. And if that woman belongs to a racialized minority, she fears that racism will define how the case is perceived and treated, how the partner, father, uncle, brother, son, she is reporting, perhaps the father of her children might end up dead. We live in a country where the insidiousness of rape culture objectifies women's bodies, where women's bodies are publicly owned, it seems, to be openly discussed in terms of body parts, attractiveness, and reduced to shaggability scales. Where women and girls are humiliated, shamed, bullied, harassed in the everyday by unsolicited comments, being hollered at in the street, touched, pulled, pressed up against, grabbed, undressed with eyes. We live in a country where on any given in any given secondary school on any given day, words like frigid, slag, slut are part of the break time banter. And if you don't play the game, the word lesbian is used as a slur. A country where women are silenced. We live in a country where the school is proactive enough to get a service in to deliver sessions on key issues like consent, but parents embargo it. Embargo those sessions on pornography, when clearly the language that young people are using to discuss sex suggests they have been exposed to damaging, hardcore material. A country where we all need to go home and find a way to have that conversation with our children. By 8 years old, many children have seen explicit still or video material. If the exposure is prolonged and repeated, it can have a long-lasting effect on their psychological well-being, and also in terms of forming lasting relationships. We live in a country where coercive behaviour means that you get to learn and know and keep your place. We live in a country where on the walk home after a night out, your key becomes a weapon between your fingers. Where we pray you get home safely, but you have to cross-check with friends that you did, and that they did too. Where the perpetrator could be your teacher, your priest, your bishop, your coach, your taxi driver, your boss, or even a police officer. Where women are kidnapped, bought and sold, trafficked. A country where Harold Shipton decided that elderly women in his care were disposable and fair game when he decided he could use his medical knowledge to murder them. We live in a country where the great Sigmund Freud dismissed a woman on whom he had operated as neurotic when she complained of pain, only to later find out that the reason she felt that pain was because he left gauze in her wound and it had become infected. But he simply dismissed it as neurotic. Women very often get dismissed for the pain that they feel. We live in a country where the criminal justice system has failed women and girls time and time again. A country where we keep trying the same old method, expecting that the outcomes will change. Where the World Cup brings fear, not national pride, and where women are beaten when the football team loses, beaten when it wins, because he drank too much while celebrating. A country where girls are taught not to take up too much space, saying no is impolite, that their only value is in how they look, that they carry and hold their family's honour, and that they can be killed if they disobey or are found to have dishonoured the family name. A country where girls who were quite happy skipping along, climbing, running, jumping at two years old, quite content and happy with who they are told through the media, social disapproval, society, education, slowly and surely, that they're not good enough, and that they go from puberty to womanhood. And as they go from puberty to womanhood, they become increasingly dissatisfied with their bodies and with themselves. A country where, as a result of the systemic pressure, women and girls die, self-harm, are mutilated, twist and contort themselves in a vain effort of attaining the impossible and ever-changing standards of beauty and perfection that society holds them to. A country where a major concern during lockdown wasn't just about who would contract the virus, who would die, who would suffer long COVID, but it equally was about how many were being raped, assaulted, abused, beaten, have their money taken, suffer coercion and bullying, and how many would die at the hands of a loved one. A country where the new domestic abuse sexual violence bill isn't up to muster. We live in a country where 2 women plus a week murdered, sexual violence starts at the tip of the iceberg, and domestic abuse is often minimised. And coercive behaviour, well, is so commonplace it's difficult to measure and quantify. And now to the personal, and I bear with me because I know I am dragging on. We live in a city where you have to wonder if the lovely young man your daughter chooses has been traumatised from an early age by repeated exposure to material produced by a pornographic industry which degrades and dehumanizes women, and how this will affect his treatment of her. A world where complacency, thinking, what happened to her? She's sensible, she's aware, we've had those talks. I've used teachable moments to broach difficult subjects I only wish that somebody would have spoken to me about. We've done all that. But I also wonder if she's been watching the pornography too. And between them, they normalise this degrading, dehumanising behaviour, and it becomes acceptable between both of them. A city where we live in a city where, as an activist campaigning on violence against women and girls, you're constantly asked, what about the men? A city where, standing in the middle of town amidst pre-Christmas shoppers, raising awareness as part of the UN 60 Days of Activism to end violence against women and girls. A woman who tells me she's 80 plus years old confides that he's beat her for years. There was no help back then, she said. I had nowhere to go. I couldn't go back to my family, so I stuck it out. And anyway, she said, it's not so bad as it used to be. A city where going to get her car fixed at a local garage led to my daughter's friend being hugged by a mechanic who later stalked her, was found sitting outside her home in his car. When she opened the door to go out, he came out of his car and said hello, called her by her name. We live in a city where a taxi driver thinks it's okay to get the number from the base and phone my daughter to ask for a date, then tried to add pressure when she said no. Her thought was, he just dropped me at home. He knows where I live. A city where my youngest daughter never went to school without wearing shorts under her uniform skirt. A city where on the night after my aunt died, I went out dancing, that she was free from her husband, her pastor and her religion insisted she couldn't leave because the fact that he beat her and took my money, despite the fact that he beat her and took her money, because it was a sin. We live in a country where my daughter locked in a train en route from Scotland ended up at King's Cross, turfed out of the station while the staff cleaned it at 1:30 a.m. Alone in an area of London known for its dangerous nighttime economy, a few months after Sarah Everard had been murdered. And driving from Derby to London would take longer for me to get there than it would for the next train, which would be at 3 a.m. She was terrified, and so was I, as I advised her to stand with her back against the wall, keep talking on the phone, and every now and then take a panoramic film of the area and the people in front of you. Men tried to initiate conversation with this lone teenager standing in the middle of London, looking terrified, holding her bags. One man passed her 3 or 4 times, and others just stood and stared, praying she had enough charge on her phone until her cousin could drive an hour across London to pick her up. A country where my youngest daughter is at university, 2 of her friends in their first semester at university were sexually assaulted. None of them sought official help. They didn't think they'd be believed because they were on a night out drinking. One of her friends, a different friend at a different university, had her drink spiked, was terribly ill, didn't report it because it might mean trouble in terms of what the university might say. That's why that was the reason she gave, despite my trying to encourage her to report it. She didn't want to report it, and so, well, you know. Okay, so we live in a city where I have 2 daughters and 2 granddaughters. I'm acutely aware of the war being fought against women and girls. I've been fighting it in my home, in society, since I became a parent, and I am on constant watch. A country where looking at months painting the screen is like looking into the mirror. Why is no one listening? Why is no one acting? Where's the action on this? Why is it piecemeal? We live in a country where a recent government commission report concluded that we should treat the issue of war as seriously as we treat terrorism. By the way, one definition of terrorism is the use of violence to control, force, intimidate, especially against civilians. And I am hoping we live in a country where those who are in power are listening and this time going to act. I hope that we live in a city where our knowledge gained from years of experience manages to reach some people today, and that they leave this session taking actions, which means you've joined us in fighting this war by making small changes in your own home, your own circle, checking on those around you, looking out for strangers and the way you would want a stranger to look out for you and the people that you love. In conclusion, I want to quickly return to the words I picked out earlier from the Cambridge and Webster online dictionaries, and they were freedom from public disturbance, freedom from violence, a quiet and calm state of mind, agreement or harmony, living and working together happily without disturbance. Now, I want you to carefully consider these words and phrases used to define peace. In the context of the Government Commission report, the police watchdog that indicated that war was as serious as terrorism, and think about some of the mundane activities that we're involved in every day. like going home after a night out, walking alone in a remote place, and going along a busy street where there might be builders and other activities going on. Think carefully about whether vague statistics and unreported instances, the kind of thing someone discloses in conversation, perhaps over a drink, but they would never report, and they did not report. Think about whether these things are indicative of women having or living in peace in their everyday. My question to you is, considering everything I've outlined, do you think that women in this country, in any country, are living in peace, or have peace of mind? If your answer is a definitive yes, then I failed miserably and have to concede on this occasion that all this talk on Paul is merely artifact, a figment of the feminist imagination. But if you conclude otherwise, or if you're unsure, I want to challenge those of you who aren't already engaged or aware or involved to try to do what you can when you can, in whatever capacity you have, to try to make sure that you're not complicit in this war and that you're not a bystander. The war on women is overwhelming, and every now and then I give up and wish for a quiet life somewhere. But I look at my daughters. I look at my granddaughters. The youngest is 2 years old. She runs everywhere. She climbs everything. She jumps in puddles and goes to get everybody's shoes when she wants to go outside. She gets the shoes and put it in front of you, and that's her making her demands. I see the defiant women in Afghanistan holding up their placards in the face of imminent danger. I see the women in Africa, in Asia. I sit in company of women I know and women I don't know, and I wonder how they've been affected by this war. I see my daughter's friends as I've watched them grow from girls to young women. I've taught, I've mentored, I've run programs for many cohorts of girls and young women, and I wonder how they're bearing up under the weight of society's consistent failure to act. And I want them to have peace, and I want them all to be free. Please don't bury your head in the sand. Don't conclude that it won't happen to me or mine. It has happened to somebody that you know or love. Don't conclude that our criminal justice system is the solution. Don't remain silent, because ultimately your silence will not protect you. It won't protect any of us. Whatever you do something. Educate yourself, write, march, teach. Believe women when they tell you their stories. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonya. It's always moving to hear you speak, and I just want to touch on the fact that we are speaking about such difficult subjects today, and that they do all affect us both personally and the loved ones we know, and that we have created some resources we want to share with everyone today, both here in person and those of you who've joined us online on Zoom today, to signpost to lots of great work out there by charities, support groups and organisations, so that if you or anyone else feels triggered or you know someone who needs help right now, there are resources out there. So I'm Vanessa Boon. I'm chair of International Women's Day in Derby, amongst various other things that I do. I'm an equality and human rights practitioner and have been for over 20 years. I've run a myriad of women's empowerment programmes, including for survivors of various forms of abuse and violations of women, including forced marriages, including honour-based abuse, domestic violence, so many different kinds. I was looking recently at some records. I think it's over 500 women who over the years I've facilitated through those programmes, and I'm delighted to say that all of those 500 plus women have moved on and are doing awesome things with their life today. But there are far too many more women we haven't reached. And I hope collectively we can up our efforts, because as Sonya said, this is urgent. This is a humanitarian crisis. So over about the next 20 minutes, I want to touch on a few themes, but then at around about 3 o'clock-ish, we want to open up and hear from you and anything you want to talk about more, or maybe things you haven't had a chance yet to touch upon, and any questions. And everyone on Zoom, you're welcome to type chat as well as joining the conversation here. As I said, I know what we're talking about is a deeply personal and painful issue for all of us. We all would have experienced something either ourselves or a loved one we know of. You know, it's that prevalent. So we will end on an uplifting, healing, affirmative note. So I just want to say that light at the end of the tunnel is there, but I am going to talk about some difficult issues because we can't have the conversation about that. A bit like Sonya, I was reflecting on what I want to say with this 20 minutes, and I highlighted a few key words. So peace, global, national, local. In this unequal world, violence is not happening equally at the same rates to everyone. Pandemic, austerity cuts, and I'm just disappointed our Police and Crime Commissioner couldn't be with us here today to discuss that matter. The Domestic Abuse Act 2021, a new piece of law I want to touch on, and the Istanbul Convention, which sets standards that our UK law is not up to scratch with globally. I want to talk about systemic. I want to talk about attitudes in our society that make it harder for victims to speak up. And importantly, I want to end on action with just a few of my thoughts of simple, small things that we can all do and encourage our neighbours, our families, our schools, our colleagues, our trade unions, anyone else you can connect with to do too. Because I know sometimes we can all feel a bit overwhelmed with all the social injustices in the world. And this one is so connected to all the other forms of oppression and climate justice as well. I know sometimes it can feel so overwhelming, this issue, and we often talk about this, that the scale of it, almost every day you open a newspaper or you look online and there is another woman taken from us, another woman where people are saying, if you were on this road at 11 p.m. last night, we are seeking witnesses, please contact us. It is relentless. And therefore it can be really overwhelming, but I'm an optimist somehow at heart still, despite all of that. And I'm digging deep for it in these times. I'll be honest, it has been particularly hard these last couple of years. But I'm digging deep and invite you to dig deep with me because I do remain an optimist because I believe in the power of us. I don't believe in the power of the system. So one of my first words of peace. I'm so grateful to the Derby Peace Week organisers for the fantastic programme that's running in Derby. I'm so glad that this subject is part of it because peace we often think of as peace between states, and I want that. Ideally, I'd like no states at all, Earthlings, but on this beautiful planet we share, I would like us to have peace. Peace in our public spaces, peace between peoples, peace in our streets, peace in our homes, peace in the relationships, peace in the way we interact with one another, and as Sonya said, peace in our own minds. Too often in our society, violence against women and girls, I feel, is presented as if it's this unconnected series of tragic, individual, sad events, as if it's all unconnected. So awful news in Derbyshire, just in the last 48 hours, about a woman called Terry Harris and her children in Kilmarsh near Chesterfield killed. We are waiting as the news story develops and we start to learn more about what has happened. But I suspect many people receiving that story as I did started to think, I suspect we probably already know what happened before they tell us. We already know the news we're likely to get over the next few days because it is such a familiar story, but it's presented as if this awful, sad, tragic, awful event that has affected the loved ones who are now grieving is this another individual tragedy, but it's not unconnected. It is part of a systemic gendercide. This is sometimes called the shadow pandemic. It was there before the current pandemic we know as COVID-19. This is a humanitarian crisis for all of a society. This is not a women's issue. This is a societal humanitarian crisis. And right now, this is a call to action. Globally, 1 in 3 women will experience intimate partner violence or other forms of violation on our watch, in our generation, in our time on this planet. That equates to 736 million women, and of course, girls too. 137 women will be killed on average on a typical day in this world by a partner or relative every day. 72% of trafficking victims are women, and of children who are trafficked, 3 out of 4 of them are girls. Thinking about the impact of climate and our burning planet, there are women who have to walk long, scary, vulnerable walks to fetch water, getting longer every day because of the changes, or because they're fighting for access to education as girls. These issues put women and girls at even more danger. These issues of inequalities, patriarchy, multiple oppressions, and climate justice are all interconnected. All of these factors make women and girls' lives more dangerous. Coming to the national. This week, based on data, we can accurately estimate that another 5 women will die due to men's violence against women and girls. 2 of them will typically be killed by a current or former partner, someone they may have declared poems with, declarations of love and care and chemistry and beauty with. Free will take their own lives because they just can't see any other way out. And that in itself is the saddest criticism of our criminal justice system, saying, report the crime, come to us. To free women we could take our own lives because they don't see that as an accessible option. 1 in 4 women across the UK will experience intimate partner violence in their lifetimes. On average, a woman will experience 35 assaults before if she even reports it to the police or criminal justice agencies. This is just on average. 97% of 18 to 24-year-olds in the UK say they've experienced sexual harassment, so particularly those younger women, but overall 80% of all women say they've experienced sexual harassment, including in public spaces. 85,000 women are victims of rape or attempted rape every year. Those are just the ones that are recorded. But of those that report it and take that incredibly brave step, pretty difficult step, of those 15% who report it, it leads to only 1.4% of those leading to the perpetrator being charged. Just 1.4%. Of those, let's see how many go further. Only 3% of that already diminishing number lead to prosecution, so it actually gets to court. And of those, 1.3% lead to a conviction. This has led to Dame Vera Baird, who is the Victims Commissioner advising the government, to declare that what we are witnessing in the UK is the effective decriminalisation of rape. I'm going to repeat that again. What we are witnessing is the decriminalisation of rape. I can't overemphasize the gravity of that and the need for us to sit up and pay attention and take action. These issues are horrendous and they happen to all women and girls, but we live in an unequal world. So some women and girls and non-binary siblings are at greater risk and are facing even higher rates of violence. Those who are most marginalised and multiply oppressed, for example, disabled women are twice as likely to experience intimate partner violence and domestic violence as non-disabled women. Bisexual women are 5 times more likely than women in general to experience intimate partner abuse. Trans and Black women experience specific kinds of trans misogyny and misogynoir. Black women have higher rates of domestic abuse-related murder as well. The homicide rate is higher still, and as Sonya said earlier, the same outrage we saw in the case of Sarah Everard is not always expressed in the same way. Amongst homeless women, this thing I want to highlight, 61% of homeless women have experienced domestic violence, and that is based on research by the charity Crisis that helps women who are homeless. So not only is these issues making women's lives at home so dangerous as well as in public spaces, but it's also forcing women out of their homes, including their children too. So we might think, why doesn't someone go to a refuge? Well, although if the Police and Crime Commissioner were here today, she might talk about the happy news that was shared earlier from the press release about the funding that I'm delighted is coming to Derbyshire to fund some prevention projects to tackle these issues. However, the amount of funding that this Conservative government has cut for over the last decade from the women's sector of charities is a greater amount of money than the amount of money they are patting themselves on the back for announcing they're putting back in. We need to see through their lies. I will not be flying the flag for this government as if they are our saviours or on our side. They are not, and we must not fall for it. Our refuges, because of their funding cuts over the last decade, mean that every day 155 women are turned away from a refuge because they're full up and there are no spaces for them. And 103 kids are turned away with them every day. During the pandemic, as it's been mentioned already, we have seen all of these rates and statistics increase, all of them. Domestic violence charities, friends and connections that I work with have been telling me how they are exhausted themselves as staff because the volume of calls to their helpline has increased even more. They were already struggling before the pandemic because of all the funding cuts. Now they are absolutely just fraught. I don't know how else to describe it. They are fraught, trying their best in an impossible situation. So the government announces that we have now a new piece of law, the Domestic Abuse Act 2021, which has taken many, many years. And it's not the credit to the government that it's come in, but to all the people who've campaigned for the changes in that law. Power to all the women in the voluntary sector, the charity sector, all the activists out there and all the allies who have been pushing for this for many years. But sadly, the government did not implement all of the things we were all campaigning for. Whilst I'm really pleased this new act brings in the first ever legal recognised definition of what domestic abuse is. You have to take a minute to take that in 2021. There has never been a clear legal definition of what domestic abuse even is before. So this is something to celebrate. Certainly, it's good that they're going to appoint a domestic abuse commissioner. So this will be someone who has the powers to provide a national strategic picture. There are new legal tools being brought in that hopefully will help some victims and families stay safe with things like domestic abuse protection orders, which will then intervene and try and disrupt when we notice risks in people's relationships. There'll be a duty on councils and local authorities to provide some kind of accommodation-based services, though it doesn't mention the word refuge. And this is important, and I ask us all to keep our eyes on what's going on there. My fear is that private contractors are going to be sensing a money-making opportunity here and will be tendering for this money and funding that's been made available to make money out of running probably quite poor quality accommodation for women, in which the victims have not been given any right to decide where they live, where their life will be, where they will be accommodated, and whether that meets their needs and wishes and the needs of their children often too. They're going to strengthen what's known as Clare's Law, which isn't actually a law, but was a piece of guidance that means that if someone enters into a new relationship, they or concerned loved ones around them have concerns and want to check whether this new partner may have a history of abusive behaviour, that they can contact the agencies and check this person for peace of mind if they feel someone might be vulnerable. This has been strengthened, and I hope it works. There are some other errors around strangulation and suffocation. Some people may know about these issues that have been particularly concerning, and many women and their families who've lost women to these sexual practices, where men are incredibly even finding a defence that is working in some courts to get away with killing women because she liked kink. We can like kink and we deserve better sex, we deserve better quality porn, but the kind we're getting is appalling, objectifying and dehumanising. Further weaknesses in this Domestic Abuse Act include that migrant women have been overlooked again. Those without recourse to public funding are not getting the same protection and rights. Also, victims' voices, again, really haven't been included enough in the legal changes. And none of the provisions in this Domestic Abuse Act that we'll be told is a big win for women and for domestic abuse doesn't even meet the standard that our government signed up to years ago, known as something called the Istanbul Convention. What this is a global agreement that lots of other countries who are way ahead of us around the world have already signed up to, including various countries that many people may assume have worse human rights records than us. In fact, we are rather poor in the UK and lagging behind. This convention sets out a number of standards to prevent, detect, disrupt, intervene, and bring justice around all forms of violence against women and girls. The laws in the UK, although our government signed up to this standard and promised they would implement it, are still not meeting those standards. So we can all lobby our MPs, our agencies to push for that. Let's get busy talking about the Istanbul Convention. Bringing it a bit local now to Derbyshire, as Sonya said, I think that's so important to make that connection to the bigger picture, but what we can do locally as well. Here in Derbyshire, typically over 8,000 cases of domestic abuse are reported to Derbyshire Constabulary each year. We know, of course, of so many more that never get reported. This accounts for 13% of all crimes in our county. I would be interested if the Commissioner was here today to see whether 13% of the budget is allocated to address it, seeing as it's 13% of all crimes. We have had some really concerning news in recent years. I see Derbyshire Constabulary making some positive efforts, which I'm encouraging, but I also see that there's so much further to go. We currently have our Derbyshire Constabulary under investigation by the Independent Office of Police Complaints, and we await their findings on the case of the murder of Gracie Spinks, who we are told did report that she was frightened because a man was stalking her. He was the man who killed her. We are still waiting to learn what has happened with Terry Harris and her children killed in Killamarsh. There was an inspection of the constabulary within the last few years which also criticised them for not adequately recording reports of domestic abuse and correctly what they call tagging them on their system, on their paperwork, which meant that They weren't getting accurate picture of which cases and crimes were domestic abuse. So something might have been reported as burglary or damage to property or assault, but hadn't also been tagged as domestic abuse. Therefore, the usual risk assessments that would have prompted did not happen. And in 2019, there was another killing of a woman in Glossop, where again, the Independent Office of Police Complaints, which is like the watchdog for the police, again had to be called in to check out what our local police service was doing. It has found fault of 2 of their police constables of not adequately performing their role, as well as systemic failures in policies and procedures at the constabulary. I know that Chief Constable Rachel Swan is busy trying to work on those and rectify those policy issues, but I'm not feeling confident. You know, and I sense I see people nodding along. These things don't make me confident to encourage people to come forward, much as I want to support any woman who needs to. It's hard to promise there's some easy way of doing that and that it's going to work for everyone. The non-recording of domestic abuse and the failure to carry out risk assessments has made us vulnerable, and we have lost too many sisters and non-binary siblings to this incompetence. There are systemic changes needed, and it's not just the police, it's all the public sector. They all have a role in this. The council provides the housing accommodation options. If they're not there, women are stuck with violent people. The CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, are the ones who manage the court process, which is meant to deliver justice. The statistics on convictions rates that I mentioned, they are absolutely appalling. There's so much change needed. And then there's the judges. And so often we hear comments from judges who have long been in the system, making appalling victim-blaming statements. How are they possibly qualified to sit in judgment upon these crimes? Training doesn't even answer this. Massive changes needed to policy, to structure. However, I'm not a big believer in a system, as some of you will know. So I'm a both and person. I believe in both pushing for change within the system we have, because at the moment it's the one we've got. But I feel more excited about creating alternatives, intervening as a community, stepping together as neighbours to work out how we can make our communities safer, how we can see the early signs of something not looking right, how we can see the early signs of relationships where the behaviour is unhealthy. How can we be better neighbours to one another? If we hear it through the walls, the neighbour next door, something doesn't sound right, there's an argument escalating, and it doesn't sound good, it doesn't sound healthy, what do we do? Or are we looking the other way? If we see someone in a nightclub dance floor getting a bum pinch or their breasts grabbed or being pushed around, do we think it's none of our business, or do we do something? If we hear that someone's unsafe, if we hear that there is a serial perpetrator in our community who keeps getting away with it and grooming our community and gaslighting victims, we need to do something. So I want to talk about attitudes and action before I just wrap up, and then we want to open it up for your questions and thoughts too. So attitudes, firstly. I want to talk about victim blaming. Sadly, I still hear some of the things I heard 20 years ago. I've been involved in this area for 20 years. So I still hear things like, but why doesn't she just leave him? And the weight of oversimplification and ignorance in that statement, just I feel it every time, no matter how many times I hear it, and I can see people nodding and resonating. The oversimplification is one who doesn't understand what a difficult thing that is to do. It's painful. Other things we hear is, why was she walking home alone? Why didn't she cover up her body? Why did she smile? Why did she say hello? Why did she make him breakfast the next morning? Why on her? The scrutiny of her. What are the questions about? Instead of asking, why doesn't she leave him? Why is he behaving in an inhumane way? How can we change that behaviour? How can we help those inflicted? I also hear flippant remarks, probably well-meaning, but so uninformed, like, well, if this is really happening, or if that is the truth, doesn't she just report it to the police then? Again, I see people nodding here in recognition. It is not that simple. Research has shown that of those who even report domestic abuse, for example, only 7 out of 10 feel able to continue supporting that prosecution and be a witness in court to stand up for themselves out of fear of repercussions. The fear that if you report it, you might not get a conviction or an outcome based on the stats I shared earlier, but you're going to be put on trial. But perpetrators, barristers, we're going to throw a load of stuff about you in there. and you might not even get a conviction or any outcome at the end of it. There's also a chance you may face repercussions from them, their family, their associates in backlash because you've raised the issue about their son, their brother, etc. There is such fear. Some people, the police and courts, I would say almost for everyone, but some people, the police and court system is especially dangerous and unsafe, particularly, for example, for Black and racially minoritized communities, for LGBTQ communities, for disabled people who have a long history of being failed by the system and being put in danger by it. For women who fear deportation because they are here on a husband's visa, they have nowhere to go. So when people flippantly say, surely if it was true, she'd just report it to the police. We need to have a conversation with compassion for that person not knowing something yet, but we need to educate people, and that's something I think we can all do to spread awareness. We need to change these attitudes. I also want to talk about language briefly. Often I hear violence against women. Who's committing the violence? Where is the erasure of the perpetrator in that statement? I hear VAWG, V-A-W-G, violence against women and girls a lot. I hear it as women's issues, women's strategy, women's safety, women's. The constant framing of it as a women's problem, for me, is problematic itself. This is a humanitarian crisis, and we all genders together need to step up to address it. If we keep not naming it male violence because we're scared that men will go, but men can be victims too, and they can, but it's not because of their gender, and we need different solutions and different tailored support men. Lots of men that I love individually. Collectively can be problematic, but individually, lots of men that I love and I want to see supported and get the help they need. It's not happening to them because of their gender, and they're not getting killed at a rate of 2 people a week like women are in domestic abuse. That word domestic is problematic for me too. Anyone else? I know from previously working inside the police service and trying to change it from the inside a couple of decades ago, how difficult that is, and how, and Moyra touched on this earlier in terms of the history here about how often it used to be called a domestic. Oh, there's a bit of a domestic. The trivialising and normalising of that as a private matter, often in a heterosexual way between man and husband and wife, it's often framed as well. We need to challenge, because it seems like it's this private thing that's no one else's business, that society shouldn't be intervening with. Someone's personal private relationship is their business. No. I don't want to live in a society, a world, a community where we look the other way, where we know that harm is being done. We need to collectively take action. We also need to spot the signs of gaslighting, where perpetrators coerce and psychologically undermine women so much that they doubt themselves, blame themselves for the behaviour. They think, I didn't cook the right dinner, I didn't dress right, I need to change how I behave, I'm imagining it. All these things that perpetrators use to bully and trick and manipulate. And they don't only do it to the victims, they can groom and charm the victim's whole family, their whole community, their colleagues at work. And they do this in a very strategic, proactive way, so that when the victim finally, if ever does speak up, everyone thinks, him? No, he's a delight. Can't imagine him ever doing that. This is something we really need to wake up to and be able to spot the red flag behaviour of. The love bombing, the showering you in praise, that, you're so lucky to be with such a good egg. What a charismatic man you found. What a good one you found there. Let's just be careful to take time before we fall into those traps. So I'll quickly end on action, because I always like to end on a positive. Things we can all do. So at the global level, there's loads of causes and action groups you could support. One example that I found a good way to channel my anger into is sponsoring a sister around the world through Women for Women International. You can sponsor a woman to engage in an empowerment program, and this will help a woman who's living in an area of war or a conflict zone where violations against women, and Sonya touched on this earlier, are used as a weapon of war. So in order to fight another group of men, the women are attacked and violated. And these women are supported by Women for Women International, and you could support and sponsor maybe. Nationally, there's lots of aims, including from Southall Black Sisters, who are doing great work to hold this government in check, and in particular on their no recourse to public funds for migrant women who are not getting the same protection and access to refuges, for example. We can campaign for the Istanbul Convention to be implemented fully, not in bits and pieces. Fed up of delays and excuses. This government have been around for a while. They keep putting it off. demand that it's implemented now. Locally, we've lost Gracie Spinks. Her community have got a petition online at the moment to call for more funding for advocates for victims of stalking. So we can all do that in Gracie's memory. Sign a petition online, please spread it around to all your friends too. There are scrutiny panels you can sit on with the police and the Crown Prosecution Service, where you can review cases that are anonymised and give them critical feedback on what they could be doing better. Maybe you could add your voice to activism, like 16 days of activism coming up this November, December, which I'm sure Sonya will talk about a bit more later. You can educate. If everyone here today, both in the room and on the Zoom, can tell 10 other people who are not here today about the key points we've been discussing, we start creating ripple effects. If you ask each of those 10 people to hold a coffee morning about it with 10 other people and spread it, we start really making our communities better and safer. We can share support groups and helplines, and we have a resource that's going to be shared, and thank you for sharing that with everyone here today. We can lobby our Police and Crime Commissioner to ensure that the funds announced today, which are hopeful and encouraging, are sustained and adequate, but also need to go back to levels they were before the decade ago with the funding cuts. We can volunteer, we can raise funds and give our funds to the charities and groups that can do the work that maybe not all of us can, but we can raise money and support them. If that's the one thing we can do, that would be great. We can raise boys well, and we can raise girls and non-binary kids strong. I believe in the power of us to change this. Thank you.
I don't know how we thank these two. I think that was, I feel quite choked up. Oh, sorry. Yeah, just a few words then to lead us into, because I think we're not recording the discussion which we go on in the moment. Pick up on just one or two tiny bits. Violence is also controlled behaviour in different sorts of ways, as I experienced myself too. I experienced very little actual physical violence in my marriage, but what I did have was unattractive, unintelligent, inarticulate for years and years and years. At the beginning of it, I knew it was more to do with his lack of confidence and self-esteem. Gradually, time, because there was a group who started running the creches. We had a lot of national conferences, regional conferences in women's age, and there was a group, the radical lesbian feminists, who took over running the creches. I thought it was great, until I overheard my still junior school children, sons, talking about it. And they were laughing, fortunately. I was horrified at what they were hearing about men and boys. The very, very negative stuff that was being directed at them. That's when I was considering my situation, and this wise woman I mentioned earlier said to me, and this is going to be my last word leading into the conversation, the discussion, is bringing up some. Bringing up sons to be good men is political activity in itself. Okay, over to discussion now. Thank you.